A millionaire's son got a young cleaner pregnant. To keep his image clean, he decided to fire her from the mansion. Years later, the media was stunned by the young woman's fate. The former cleaner now showed the power of a determined woman. The sun had barely risen when Sarah Johnson crossed the imposing gates of the Blackwell mansion. Her hesitant steps on the gravel driveway echoed like drums in her ears as she nervously adjusted her newly acquired uniform. At 14 years old, she carried on her shoulders the responsibility of helping her family, and this job as a cleaning assistant represented her only hope. The mansion loomed majestically before her, its mirrored windows reflecting the morning sky. Sarah felt a chill in her stomach as she contemplated the magnitude of the building that seemed more like a palace. Her calloused hands, already marked by early work, clutched the small bag where she kept her document and the letter of recommendation from the neighbor who had arranged her employment. Mrs. Sullivan, the middle-aged housekeeper with a stern expression, received her at the staff entrance. Her scrutinizing eyes examined Sarah from head to toe, as if appraising merchandise. "You're very young," she observed with a tone of disapproval. But Mrs. Blackwell insisted on giving a chance to Mrs. Thompson's protégé. "We'll see if you're up to the task." The young girl followed the housekeeper through the gleaming corridors, absorbing every detail of the luxurious environment. The paintings on the walls seemed to observe her, and the Italian marble floor reflected her apprehensive face. The smell of cleaning products mingled with the refined perfume that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. During the tour of the house, Mrs. Sullivan meticulously explained each function Sarah would have to perform. The list seemed endless: cleaning the guest rooms, assisting in organizing the laundry, polishing the silver objects in the dining room, among other tasks. "And remember," warned the housekeeper, "the family members are reserved and discreet. Do not speak to them unless directly questioned, especially to the young masters." It was precisely at that moment that Sarah saw him for the first time. Jason. Blackwell, the youngest son of the family, was coming down the stairs with the confidence of his 17 years. His dark hair fell carelessly over his green eyes, inherited from his Portuguese mother, and his carefree smile lit up the room. Sarah's heart involuntarily quickened. Jason passed by them as if they were invisible, but at the last instant, their eyes met. It was just a fraction of a second, but enough for the young girl to feel her cheeks burn. The days turned into weeks, and Sarah adapted to the routine of the mansion. She learned to move silently through the rooms, to anticipate the needs of the residents, to make herself useful without being noticed. But it was impossible not to notice Jason. He had a habit of studying in the library during the afternoons, and Sarah always found an excuse to clean the bookshelves during those hours. Sometimes she caught the young heir observing her through the reflection in the windows, but both pretended not to notice the growing tension between them. It was on a rainy autumn afternoon that everything changed. Sarah was organizing books on the highest shelf, precariously balanced on a ladder, when she felt his presence behind her. The shock made her lose her balance, but before she could fall, she felt Jason's strong arms supporting her. "You could have hurt yourself," he whispered, still holding her. Their faces were too close and his scent intoxicated her. "I'm sorry, sir." She tried to disentangle herself, aware of the impropriety of that situation. "Jason?" he gently corrected. "Call me Jason." From that day on, they began a dangerous game of glances and furtive encounters. Jason started to appear coincidentally in the places where she worked. Whispered conversations in empty corridors, brushing of hands as they passed. Each other, knowing smiles exchanged in secret. Sarah knew she was playing with fire. Mrs. Sullivan's words echoed in her mind as a constant warning, but her teenage heart couldn't resist the charm of the young heir. Jason, in turn, seemed increasingly enchanted by the simplicity and sweetness of the young maid. One night when the family had gone out to a charity event, Jason surprised her in the kitchen. Without saying a word, he took her hands in his and kissed her. It was a sweet and inexperienced kiss, characteristic of their youth but full of silent promises. "This is madness," Sarah whispered, when they finally parted. "Maybe it is," Jason replied, caressing her face, "but I've never felt anything so right in my entire life." What began as a teenage romance grew in intensity. Secret meetings in the garden after hours, notes hidden between the pages of library books, promises whispered in the shadows. Jason talked about running away together, about facing his family, about a future that seemed to belong to a fairy tale. Sarah allowed herself to dream. She forgot about the social differences, the certain disapproval of his family, the risks she was taking. At 17, Jason had the power to make her believe that love could overcome any obstacle. But fate had other plans for that forbidden romance. And on a spring morning, while the mansion's garden exploded in colors, Sarah discovered that she carried in her womb the fruit of that impossible love. The news, which should have been a cause for joy, fell upon her like a sentence. The discovery of the pregnancy transformed the fairy tale into a nightmare. Sarah spent days trying to gather the courage to tell Jason, while fighting against mourning, sickness and the fear growing in her chest. Her hands trembled as she cleaned the mansion's corridors, and her heart raced every time she heard footsteps approaching. It was on a Thursday afternoon that she finally managed to give Jason a note, asking him to meet her in the garden after everyone was asleep. The young heir appeared punctually, his face illuminated by the full moon, revealing the concern over the urgent tone of the message. "Jason," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm expecting a child. Our child." The silence that followed was deafening. Jason, always so eloquent, seemed to have lost the ability to speak. His face went through a series of emotions: surprise, fear, confusion, and finally something Sarah couldn't decipher. "Are you sure?" was all he managed to say, his voice choked. "Absolutely," she replied, feeling tears starting to roll. "What are we going to do?" Jason ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she knew well, a sign of his anxiety. "I need time to think," he finally said. "I need to find a way to tell my parents, to solve this." But time was not on their side. The next morning, Sarah was called to the main office of the mansion. Her heart almost stopped when she saw not only Jason's parents, but also Mrs. Sullivan and a family lawyer seated around the imposing mahogany desk. "So it's true," Mrs. Blackwell's voice cut through the air like a razor. "The little maid seduced my son." Sarah felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. How had they found out? Her eyes instinctively searched for Jason, but he wasn't present. "Ma'am, she tried to explain, but was interrupted by Mr. Blackwell. "We don't want to hear your excuses," he declared coldly. "We've already made our decision. You will be properly financially compensated to keep quiet about this incident, and you will never approach this family again." "But the baby?" Sarah protested, her hands instinctively protecting her still flat belly. "What baby?" Mrs. Blackwell laughed humorlessly. "You think we believe that story? It's obvious you're trying to pull a gold digger scheme." The lawyer pushed an envelope across the table. "Here's a generous amount and a bus ticket to your hometown. I suggest you accept it and leave immediately." "Can I at least talk to Jason?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Jason is on his way to Europe," Mrs. Blackwell informed with a cruel smile. "An emergency exchange program. He doesn't want to see you." The words hit Sarah like a slap. Jason had left without saying goodbye, without fighting for her, without even knowing he would be a father. Or maybe he knew and had chosen to run away from the responsibility. Mrs. Sullivan escorted her to her room in the back of the house, watching as she gathered her few belongings. "I warned you about the young masters," said the housekeeper, her voice surprisingly soft. But the young heart rarely listens to advice. With a small suitcase and the envelope containing money she didn't want but knew she would need, Sarah left the Blackwell mansion. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the garden where, not long ago, she and Jason had exchanged vows of eternal love. Walking aimlessly through the city streets, Sarah felt completely lost. She couldn't go home. Her parents would never understand or accept her situation. She had no friends in the big city, no qualifications beyond incomplete elementary education. It was when, sitting on a park bench trying to decide her next move, a strong wind snatched some papers from the briefcase of a man passing by in a hurry. Without thinking, she got up and ran to help collect the scattered documents. "Thank you," "Very much," said the man, a middle-aged gentleman with a police badge attached to his belt. "These are important department documents." Sarah handed over the papers, her hands still trembling from the emotion of recent events. The man, who introduced himself as Detective Robert Matthews, noticed her disturbed state. "Is everything all right, young lady?" he asked with genuine concern. Something in the detective's fatherly voice made the tears, held back for so long, finally overflow. Between sobs, Sarah found herself telling her story to this stranger, who listened with attention and compassion. "Come with me," he said, after hearing the entire account. "I know a place where you can stay for now and maybe even get a job." At that moment, without knowing it, Sarah was taking her first step towards a new life. A life that she would build with her own hands, no longer as the naive girl who dreamed of fairy tales, but as a determined woman to create a dignified future for herself and her child. The restaurant Flavor and Affection didn't have the glamour of the Blackwell mansion, but for Sarah, it represented a new beginning. Detective Matthews introduced her to Mrs. Lewis, the owner of the establishment, a 60-year-old lady with gray hair and a welcoming smile. The small restaurant was located in a modest neighborhood, but had loyal clientele, mainly workers from local businesses. "Experience in the kitchen?" asked Mrs. Lewis, observing the young woman with attentive eyes. "Just the basics I learned at home," Sarah replied timidly. "But I learn quickly and I'm not afraid of hard work." Mrs. Lewis exchanged a significant look with Detective Matthews, who nodded discreetly. "Well," she said, "I need someone to help. In the kitchen and in the dining room. The work is hard and the salary is modest, but we offer lodging in the small back room and 3 meals a day." Sarah felt tears return to her eyes, this time of gratitude. "When can I start?" "Right now," replied Mrs. Lewis, handing her an apron. "The first lesson is that in my kitchen no one stands still." The first days were a test of physical and emotional endurance. Sarah woke up before sunrise to help prepare breakfast, spent the day between pots and dishes, and only rested after the last customer left the restaurant. The pregnancy nausea made the work even more challenging, but she refused to show weakness. Mrs. Lewis, who initially seemed stern, revealed herself to be a patient and caring mentor. Noticing Sarah's genuine interest in cooking, she began to teach her the secrets of her traditional recipes. "Food is like life, girl," she would say, while demonstrating how to prepare her famous tomato sauce. "It needs time, attention, and love. Especially love." The weeks turned into months, and Sarah discovered in herself a natural talent for gastronomy. Her hands, previously dedicated only to cleaning, now created dishes that made customers sigh with satisfaction. Her first original dish, a reinterpretation of the traditional shepherd's pie, quickly became the clientele's favorite. As her belly grew, so did her confidence. Mrs. Lewis accompanied her to prenatal consultations and helped prepare the baby's layette. Detective Matthews, who had become a father figure, often appeared for lunch and to check if she was doing well. "You have a special gift," commented a regular customer after tasting her newest creation, a ravioli stuffed with pumpkin and cottage cheese. "You managed to transform simple ingredients into something extraordinary." It was during a particularly busy afternoon that Sarah had an idea that would change her future. Observing how customers reacted positively to her culinary innovations, which mixed traditional techniques with contemporary touches, she began to dream of her own restaurant. "Do you think I could one day?" she started to ask Mrs. Lewis, but didn't have the courage to complete the sentence. "Have your own restaurant?" completed the lady, smiling. "Of course you could. You have talent, dedication, and most importantly, you understand that true gastronomy is not about impressing, it's about nourishing people's souls." Sarah began to dedicate her few free hours to study. With Mrs. Lewis's help, she enrolled in a night course to complete her studies and began to read everything she could about restaurant management and gastronomy. One night, while organizing the day's accounts, Mrs. Lewis made a proposal that caught her by surprise. "How about we start doing some special events on Sundays? You could create a tasting menu, something more elaborate. We'd split the profits." The idea was an immediate success. Sarah's Sunday dinners began to attract a different clientele, including some local food critics. Her creations, which blended references from regional cuisine with refined techniques, caught the attention of specialized media. In the 8th month of pregnancy, Sarah had already managed to save a small nest egg and make a name for herself in the city's gastronomic circuit. Her son, whom she already knew was a boy, kicked enthusiastically whenever she was in the kitchen as if approving her culinary creations. "See," said Mrs. Lewis, placing her hand on the young woman's belly, "a chef is already being born in there." One afternoon, while preparing a new dish for the menu, Sarah was surprised by an unexpected visit. An elegant man, who introduced himself as Richard Henderson, owner of a successful chain of restaurants, had come especially to meet the young chef, who was revolutionizing the local gastronomy. "I heard you're self-taught," he commented, after tasting her famous shepherd's pie. "Impressive. I'd like to talk about a possible partnership." Sarah felt her heart race. It was her first real opportunity to realize her dream of having her own restaurant. But before she could respond, another familiar figure crossed the door of the establishment, making her world spin. Jason Blackwell was back. Time seemed to freeze when Sarah and Jason's gazes met. He was different, more mature, with a sophisticated air acquired during his time in Europe. His green eyes, however, still had the same power to make her tremble inside. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. His eyes instantly dropped to her prominent belly, and all color drained from his face. Richard Henderson, sensing the tension in the environment, discreetly moved towards one of the tables, pretending to examine the menu. Mrs. Lewis, who knew the whole story, positioned herself protectively next to Sarah. "What do you want?" asked Sarah, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. She was no longer the frightened girl who had left the Blackwell mansion. I came back a week ago," Jason stammered, clearly unprepared for the situation. "When I read about you in the newspaper's food column, I couldn't believe it. I needed to see it with my own eyes." "Well, you've seen it," she replied, unconsciously protecting her belly with her hands. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a restaurant to run." "Please," he begged, taking a step towards her. "We need to talk. I didn't know. When I left, I didn't know about the baby. My parents sent me to Europe without explanation. I only found out the truth months later, through my sister." Sarah felt a pang in her heart. During all these months, she had nurtured the hurt, imagining that Jason had chosen to abandon her. The possibility that he had also been a victim of his family's manipulations had never crossed her mind. "Mr. Blackwell," interrupted Richard Henderson, approaching again, "forgive my intrusion, but Miss Sarah and I were in the middle of an important business meeting." Jason looked at the businessman as if he had just noticed his presence. His eyes narrowed slightly. "And you are Richard Henderson, owner of the Premium Flavor Restaurants," he introduced himself with a polite smile. "I'm here to propose a partnership to Miss Sarah. Her talent is too exceptional to be restricted to a single establishment." Sarah observed the interaction between the two men with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. Jason, the first love, who had broken her heart, and Richard, who represented an opportunity to realize her professional dreams. "Sarah," Jason spoke again, deliberately ignoring Richard's presence, "I know I have no right to ask anything, but please, give me a chance to explain everything, to be part of our child's life." The mention of the baby caused the small being in her belly to move, as if recognizing its father's voice. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to organize her thoughts. "Tomorrow," she finally replied. "We can talk tomorrow after lunch hours. Now, as Mr. Henderson mentioned, I'm in an important meeting." Jason nodded, resigned. Before leaving, he took a card from his pocket and left it on the counter. "My personal number, not my parents', not the company's, mine." After he left, Sarah needed to lean on the counter to avoid falling. Mrs. Lewis quickly brought a glass of water, while Richard waited patiently for her to compose herself. "I'm sorry about that," she murmured, but Richard waved away the apologies. "There's nothing to apologize for," he smiled gently. "In fact, this only increases my admiration for you. Building all this on your own, in your circumstances, It's even more impressive than I imagined." In the hours that followed, Richard laid out his proposal. He wanted to open a new restaurant, more sophisticated than the previous ones, and offered Sarah not only the position of executive chef, but also partnership in the venture. "You'll have total creative freedom," he assured. "I want your signature to be the soul of the place. And of course, we can adjust your hours when the baby is born." The proposal was tempting. More than tempting, it was practically a dream. But Sarah asked for time to think. Her head was spinning with the day's events. That night, back at the hotel, Sarah gathered her inner circle for a private celebration. Gabriel prepared a simple but delicious dinner using local ingredients. Her son, although fighting sleep, insisted on staying awake to toast like a grown-up. As they savored the meal, the conversation naturally flowed to the future. Richard spoke about expansion plans for Roots and Wings. Jason mentioned the possibility of opening a branch of Culinary Seeds in New York. Gabriel, with a twinkle in his eyes, whispered something about putting down roots more permanently in the United States. Mrs. Lewis, observing everything with her wise gaze, finally spoke. "My dear, look around you. See what you've built, the lives you've touched. Remember that scared girl who arrived in my kitchen years ago. You've turned every obstacle into a stepping stone, every criticism into motivation. Whatever you decide to do next, I know it will be extraordinary." Mrs. Lewis's words resonated deeply with Sarah. Looking at the people gathered around her, her son, the father of her child, her partner, her business mentor, and her second mother, she felt a wave of gratitude and clarity. The future, with all its possibilities and challenges, stretched before her like an infinite menu of possibilities. And Sarah knew that with the right ingredients, love, dedication, and a dash of daring, she could create something truly memorable. As the night progressed and the Empire State Building glowed in the distance, Sarah made a silent toast to the past that had shaped her, the present that fulfilled her, and the future that promised even more culinary and personal adventures. The return to the United States after the award ceremony in Paris was marked by a warm reception. Fans, journalists, and aspiring chefs awaited Sarah at the airport, turning her arrival into a real event. Between flashes and requests for autographs, she found herself reflecting on how her life had transformed in recent years. In the days that followed, Sarah immersed herself in a series of meetings to discuss the future of her ventures. The TV show proposal continued to linger in her mind, a tempting opportunity to further expand her impact. It was during one of these meetings that a bold idea began to take shape. "What if we combined everything?" proposed Sarah, her eyes shining with the excitement of a new challenge. The TV show, Culinary Seeds, and a new approach for Roots and Wings. The idea was ambitious. Create a reality show that would follow young talents from Culinary Seeds in a culinary competition. The winner would gain the opportunity to work at Roots and Wings and open their own food truck, sponsored by the program. "This isn't just entertainment," Sarah explained to the production team. "It's a real chance to change lives and inspire a new generation of chefs." The concept was received with enthusiasm, and soon the preparations for the show, titled Flavors of Tomorrow, were in full swing. Sarah found herself immersed in a new world of cameras, scripts, and culinary challenges. Meanwhile, her personal life was also undergoing significant transformations. Gabriel, fulfilling his promise to put down roots in the United States, proposed that they live together. The decision wasn't easy, considering the family dynamic already established with Jason and their son, but with open dialogue and mutual respect, they found an arrangement that worked for everyone. Their son, now 7 years old, was more than excited about the news. "Can I be a judge on the show, Mom?" he asked, making Sarah laugh with his imitations of food critics. The recordings of Flavors of Tomorrow began, bringing renewed energy to Culinary Seeds. The participants, young people from different parts of the United States, brought stories of overcoming and a contagious passion for cooking. Sarah found herself deeply touched by the competitors' journeys. There was Lisa, an 18-year-old from a community in Los Angeles whose talent for vegan dishes surprised everyone. Carlos, a 20-year-old man from rural Texas, blended modern techniques with traditional recipes from his grandmother. and Mariana, a 23-year-old single mother, whose determination to create a better future for her daughter through gastronomy moved everyone. As the program progressed, Sarah realized she was learning as much as she was teaching. Each challenge, each story shared by the participants, added new layers to her own understanding of cooking and life. A particularly emotional episode involved a comfort food challenge, where participants had to create dishes inspired by their childhood memories. The stories and flavors that emerged were so powerful that Sarah decided to incorporate some of them into the Roots and Wings menu. The success of the program exceeded all expectations. Flavors of Tomorrow became a national phenomenon, attracting millions of viewers and inspiring a movement of appreciation for social gastronomy. As the show approached its conclusion, Sarah found herself facing an unexpected decision. The success of the program had generated invitations to expand the concept internationally. Producers from various countries were interested in creating local versions of Flavors of Tomorrow and Culinary Seeds. The prospect of taking her project to the world was exciting, but also scary. It would mean more travel, more time away from home, new cultural and logistical challenges. One night, after a long day of filming, Sarah gathered her inner circle for a frank conversation. Gabriel, Jason, Richard, Mrs. Lewis, and even her son, who insisted on staying awake for the adult meeting, gathered in the home kitchen. "I need your opinion," Sarah began, her voice mixing exhaustion and excitement. "Expanding internationally is an incredible opportunity, but it also means big changes for all of us." The discussion that followed was intense and exciting. Each offered their perspective, weighing pros and cons. Gabriel talked about the culinary possibilities of working in different cultures. Jason expressed concern about how this would affect Sarah's time with their son, but also recognized the importance of the opportunity. Richard addressed the practical and financial aspects of expansion. It was her son, however, who offered the most surprising perspective. "Mom," he said, his voice small but decided, "you always say that food brings people together. Imagine how many people you can unite around the world." The simple but profound words of her son touched Sarah deeply. She looked around the table at the people who formed her foundation and felt a wave of gratitude and courage. "Let's do this," she finally announced, "but let's do it our way, together." That night, while the rest of the house slept, Sarah stayed awake, her mind buzzing with ideas. The future opened before her like a vast menu of possibilities, full of new flavors to explore and lives to transform. With a smile, she began to sketch plans for the next great adventure. The world was waiting, and Sarah was ready to serve it. With all the love, creativity, and passion she had cultivated throughout her extraordinary journey. The months that followed the decision to expand internationally were a whirlwind of activities for Sarah and her team. The challenge of adapting Flavors of Tomorrow and Culinary Seeds to different cultures and socio-economic realities was monumental, but also incredibly stimulating. The first stop on the global journey was Mexico. Sarah, accompanied by Gabriel and a small team from the United States, arrived in Mexico City determined to deeply understand the rich local culinary tradition before implementing the program. "We can't simply replicate what we did in the US," she explained during a meeting with local producers. "We need to honor Mexican culture and traditions, incorporating them organically into our concept." The days were long and intense. Sarah immersed herself headfirst into the Mexican gastronomic scene, visiting from renowned restaurants to humble street taquerias. Each flavor, each technique, each story behind the traditional dishes was absorbed with enthusiasm and respect. It was during a visit to a local market that Sarah had an encounter that would change her perspective. Doña Esperanza, a 70-year-old lady who sold traditional sauces and seasonings, shared with her recipes that had been passed down for generations in her family. "Food is our history, our soul," said Doña Esperanza, her eyes shining with wisdom. "When we cook, we're not just feeding bodies, we're keeping our culture alive." Inspired by this encounter, Sarah decided to incorporate a new element into the Mexican Flavors of Tomorrow local mentors. Experienced chefs and traditional cooks would be invited to share their knowledge with the young participants, creating a bridge between the past and future of Mexican gastronomy. The launch of the program in Mexico was a resounding success. The fusion between the innovative techniques taught by Sarah and the deep respect for local culinary tradition won over the public and critics. The Mexican culinary seeds, installed in a low-income neighborhood of Mexico City, quickly became a beacon of hope and opportunity for young aspiring chefs. Meanwhile, in the United States, Jason and Richard kept operations running smoothly. Her son, now 8 years old, divided his time between school and special classes at Roots and Wings, where he developed a precocious talent for cooking under the loving supervision of Mrs. Lewis. The nightly video calls with her son were the highlight of Sarah's day. "Mom, guess what?" he exclaimed excitedly one night. "I made my first bechamel sauce today. Mrs. Lewis said it was perfect." Pride and longing mixed in Sarah's heart. The distance was difficult, but she knew she was building something important, not just for herself, but for countless young people around the world. After the success in Mexico, the expansion continued at an accelerated pace. India, South Africa, Italy, each country presented new challenges and unique opportunities. Sarah strived to immerse herself in the local culture of each place, always seeking the perfect fusion between innovation and tradition. In India, she marveled at the complexity of the spices and millennial techniques. In South Africa, she was fascinated by the diversity of culinary influences. In Italy, she rediscovered her gastronomic roots alongside Gabriel, who guided her through the traditions of his homeland. In each country, flavors of tomorrow and culinary seeds were adapted to reflect local realities, always maintaining the spirit of social transformation through gastronomy. It was during the inauguration of Culinary Seeds in Naples that Sarah received surprising news. UNESCO was considering including the project in the list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity, recognizing its global impact on the preservation and evolution of culinary traditions. Moved by the news, Sarah decided it was time to gather all the people who had made that dream possible. She organized a special event at the original Roots and Wings in New York, inviting representatives from all countries where the project had been implemented. The night of the event was magical. The restaurant was decorated with elements from all cultures that now were part of the Flavors of Tomorrow family. Chefs, students, and mentors from various countries mingled, exchanging stories and recipes. Sarah, radiant in a dress that blended elements from all the cultures she had embraced, took the stage to give a speech. By her side were Gabriel, Jason, Richard, Mrs. Lewis, and of course, her son, now a young chef in training. "When I started this journey," she began, her voice choked with emotion, "I could never have imagined where it would take me. Each one of you, each country, each tradition I've known has added a new ingredient to the recipe of my life." She paused, looking lovingly at her son. "My boy taught me that love is the most important seasoning in any dish, and it's with love that we'll continue to spread this message around the world, that food has the power to unite, to heal, to transform." As the audience applauded emotionally, Sarah felt a deep sense of accomplishment. Her journey, which had begun in such difficult circumstances, had transformed into something greater than she could ever have dreamed. The future still held many challenges and adventures, but Sarah knew that, with her family, both blood and chosen, by her side, she was ready to face anything. The world was her kitchen, and she could hardly wait to see what new flavors destiny had in store for her. 5 years passed since the global expansion of Flavors of Tomorrow and Culinary Seeds. Sarah, now 36, had become an iconic figure in the world of gastronomy and social entrepreneurship. Her impact went far beyond cooking. She was seen as a visionary who used food as a tool for social and cultural transformation. UNESCO's recognition as intangible cultural heritage of humanity had opened even more doors. Governments and international organizations sought Sarah's expertise to implement development programs based on gastronomy. She traveled constantly, dividing her time between inspiring lectures, consultancies, and of course, kitchens around the world. Her son, now 13 years old, was becoming a talented young chef in his own right. He often accompanied his mother on Her travels, absorbing culinary knowledge from different cultures and developing a sophisticated palate and a deep understanding of the unifying power of food. On a sunny morning in New York, Sarah received a phone call that caught her by surprise. It was an invitation to be the main speaker at the United Nations General Assembly at a special event on food security and sustainable development. "They want me to talk about how gastronomy can be a catalyst for social and economic changes," she explained to Gabriel, who watched her with a mixture of pride and admiration. The preparation for the UN speech became a family project. Jason contributed data on the economic impact of culinary seeds in the countries where it had been implemented. Richard provided insights on how the model could be scaled globally. Mrs. Lewis, with her practical wisdom, reminded Sarah not to forget the seasoning of humility in her speech. Her son, determined to contribute, suggested a bold idea. "Mom, what if you not only talked about food, but used it to demonstrate your point?" His suggestion triggered an ambitious plan. Sarah decided that, in addition to her speech, she would offer a unique banquet for the UN delegates. Each dish would be a fusion of ingredients and techniques from different countries, where flavors of tomorrow had made an impact, symbolizing how food could unite cultures and promote mutual understanding. In the weeks leading up to the event, the kitchen of Roots and Wings transformed into a global culinary laboratory. Chefs from various countries who had participated in Sarah's programs came to New York to collaborate on the menu. The air was filled with exotic aromas and the sound of different languages, all united by the universal language of cooking. Finally, the big day arrived. The UN General Assembly Hall was packed. Diplomats, world leaders, and representatives of international organizations anxiously awaited Sarah's speech. Dressed in an outfit that incorporated traditional elements from various countries, Sarah took the podium. Her gaze swept across the room, briefly resting on her family in the front row. Gabriel, Jason, her son Richard, and Mrs. Lewis, all beaming with pride. "Distinguished delegates, world leaders," she began, her voice firm and passionate. "I stand before you today not just as a chef, but as someone who has witnessed the transformative power of food. Gastronomy is not just about feeding bodies, it's about nourishing dreams, cultivating communities, and sowing change." She shared moving stories of young people whose lives had been transformed by culinary seeds. From a girl from a favela in Rio, who was now an executive chef in a starred restaurant, to a boy from a village in India who had revolutionized local agriculture with sustainable culinary techniques. "Each dish we prepare," Sarah continued, "is an opportunity to honor the past, celebrate the present, and shape the future. Food has the power to break down barriers, to build bridges between cultures, to nourish not just our bodies, but our souls." At the end of her speech, Sarah made a surprising invitation. "Now I'd like to invite you to a very special banquet, a banquet that will not only feed us, but remind us of our shared humanity and our collective potential to create a more just and sustainable world." The banquet that followed was an unprecedented sensory and emotional experience. Each dish told a story of transformation. Each flavor was a testimony to the unifying power of food. Delegates from historically conflicting countries found themselves sharing meals and stories, finding common ground through gastronomy. As she observed the scene, Sarah felt a deep sense of accomplishment. Her journey, which had begun in such humble circumstances, had transformed into a global movement of positive change. That night, back at the hotel, Sarah gathered her family for an intimate celebration. As they savored a simple meal prepared by her son, she looked at each beloved face around her. "You are the true ingredients of my happiness," she said, raising her glass. "Each of you has added a unique flavor to the recipe of my life." Gabriel hugged her lovingly. Jason smiled with paternal pride. Richard raised his glass in a silent toast. Mrs. Lewis wiped away a tear of happiness, and her son, with eyes shining with admiration, said, "One day, Mum, I'll continue your legacy." Sarah smiled, her heart overflowing with gratitude and love. The future was bright and full of possibilities, like an infinite menu of experiences and flavors to be explored. and she could hardly wait to see what new dishes life had in store for her. The years that followed the UN speech were ones of intense activity and growth for Sarah and her global network of projects. Flavors of Tomorrow and Culinary Seeds had expanded to over 50 countries, transforming into a global movement of empowerment through gastronomy. Sarah, now 40, found herself at a crossroads. The success of her ventures was undeniable, but she felt it was time for a new evolution. After months of reflection and discussions with her family and team, she came to a bold decision. It was time to pass the torch. "I'm not retiring," she explained during a meeting with her global team, broadcast live to all Culinary Seeds units around the world. "I'm evolving. It's time to make room for new voices, new ideas." The plan was ambitious. Transform the management of Flavors of Tomorrow and Culinary Seeds into a global cooperative model. Each country would have autonomy to adapt the programs to their local realities, but all would be united by a common philosophy of social transformation through gastronomy. Her son, now 17 and about to graduate high school, was the first to support his mother's decision. "It's like in the kitchen, Mom," he said with wisdom beyond his years. "Sometimes we need to step back a little for the dish to develop its own flavors." The transition wouldn't be easy. Sarah spent the following months traveling tirelessly, preparing local leaders to take on more responsibilities. In each country, she sought to identify and nurture talents that could carry the project forward. It was during one of these trips, in a small village in northern Thailand, that Sarah had an encounter that reaffirmed her decision. She met Mai, a 19-year-old girl who had transformed the local economy through techniques learned at Culinary Seeds. Mai had created a cooperative that united local farmers and young chefs, revitalizing traditional dishes and creating new recipes that attracted tourists from all over the world. "You gave us the tools," Mai told Sarah, "but we found our own culinary voice." Back in the United States, Sarah immersed herself in preparations for what would be her last major project as direct leader, a global gastronomy festival that would bring together representatives from all countries where Flavors of Tomorrow and Culinary Seeds had left their mark. The event, dubbed Flavors Without Borders, would be held in New York, where it all began, the first Roots and Wings. For a week, the city would transform into a melting pot of culinary cultures, with chefs from around the world sharing their stories, techniques, and visions for the future. The preparations for the festival were intense. Gabriel coordinated the culinary logistics, ensuring that each country had the necessary ingredients for their demonstrations. Jason and Richard took care of the financial and organizational aspects. Mrs. Lewis, even at 80, insisted on personally supervising the hospitality for international guests. Her son, in turn, surprised everyone by proposing a special challenge for the festival, a competition where teams from different countries would work together to create dishes that fuse their culinary cultures. "It's a way to show that our differences can create something beautiful when we work together," he explained, filling Sarah with pride. On the opening night of the festival, Roots and Wings was unrecognizable. The space had been expanded to accommodate stands from over 50 countries, each showcasing their culinary specialties and transformation stories. Sarah, dressed in an outfit that incorporated elements from all represented cultures, took the stage for her opening speech. Looking at the diverse crowd before her, chefs, farmers, students, diplomats, she felt a wave of emotion. 26 years ago, she began, her voice laden with emotion. "I was a scared young girl, pregnant and without prospects, working as a cleaning assistant. Today I stand before you not as a leader, but as part of a global community of dreamers and achievers." She paused, her eyes finding the familiar faces of her family in the front row. "What we've built together goes far beyond gastronomy. We've created bridges between cultures, transformed lives, and shown that food can be the universal language of hope and change." As the festival progressed, Sarah found herself assuming a new role, that of observer and mentor. She walked through the stands, listening to stories, tasting dishes, and most importantly, seeing how the movement she had initiated had taken on a life of its own. On the closing night, after a week of intense culinary and cultural exchanges, Sarah gathered all participants for a special dinner. The menu, collaboratively created by chefs from various countries, was a celebration of diversity and unity found through food. As she observed the scene, hundreds of people from different backgrounds sharing meals, stories, and dreams, Sarah felt a deep sense of accomplishment. Her legacy wasn't just the restaurants, TV shows, or even the culinary schools. It was this global community, united by the transformative power of gastronomy. Later that night, in an intimate moment with her family, Sarah finally shared her plans for the future. "I'm going back to my roots," she announced, surprising everyone. "I want to open a small cooking school right here in New York, not to train famous chefs, but to teach ordinary people to rediscover the joy of cooking, of sharing meals, of using food as a form of connection." As her family absorbed the news, her son approached, his eyes shining with determination. "And I," he said, "want to continue expanding what you started, Mum. I want to take culinary seeds to places we haven't reached yet." Sarah hugged her son, feeling a mixture of pride and nostalgia. The cycle was completing itself, and a new generation was ready to take over and expand her legacy. That night, as the city slept and the last echoes of the festival faded away, Sarah reflected on her journey. From a hopeless young girl to a global force for change, each stage of her life had been an essential ingredient in the recipe of her destiny. 5 years passed since Flavors Without Borders. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Sarah's small culinary school, illuminating a scene of serene activity and purpose. Sarah, now 45, moved between the counters, guiding a diverse group of students. There were housewives seeking reconnection with their culinary roots, stressed executives discovering the therapy of cooking, and curious young people exploring new gastronomic horizons. "Remember," she would say, her face marked by lines of expression that spoke of years of smiles and overcome challenges, "every dish you prepare is a story, its memory, its culture, its love materialized." The school, affectionately named Kitchen of the Heart, had become a refuge in bustling downtown New York. Here Sarah rediscovered the joy of small daily victories, the gleam in a student's eyes upon mastering a technique, the emotion of someone recreating a childhood dish. While guiding a student in the art of making homemade pasta, Sarah was interrupted by the sound of her cell phone. It was a video call from her son, now 22 years old. "Mom!" he exclaimed, his radiant face filling the screen. Behind him, Sarah could see the majestic mountains of Nepal. "You won't believe what happened here." Her son had taken the lead in the global expansion of Culinary Seeds, taking the project to some of the most remote and challenging regions of the world. His passion and dedication reminded Sarah of herself in her early career years. "We managed to establish a partnership with a local farmers cooperative," her son continued, excited. "We're creating a program that combines traditional agricultural techniques with culinary innovations. It's amazing to see how gastronomy can impact an entire production chain." Sarah listened with pride as her son detailed the plans for the new project. He had inherited not only her culinary talent, but also her vision of using gastronomy as a tool for social transformation. After ending the call, Sarah returned to her class with a renewed smile. She looked around the room at the concentrated faces of her students and felt a wave of gratitude. That night, as was tradition, Sarah organized a family dinner. Gabriel, Jason, Richard, and Mrs. Lewis, now a respectable 85 years old but still agile in the kitchen, gathered around the table. As they savored the dishes, a fusion of traditional recipes Sarah had learned over the years with modern touches inspired by her son's global adventures, the conversation flowed animatedly. Richard shared the latest news about the Roots and Wings network, which continued to thrive under new leadership. Jason talked about the success of the scholarship program he had created for young culinary talents. Gabriel, who now divided his time between gastronomic consulting and Italian cooking classes for children, told funny stories of his little apprentices. Mrs. Lewis, observing the scene with bright eyes, raised her glass in a toast. "To Sarah," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "who taught us that the true recipe of life is made of love, courage, and the willingness to always share the best we have." Sarah, moved, looked at the beloved faces around her. Each of them, represented a crucial chapter in her journey, an essential ingredient in the recipe of her life. At that moment, surrounded by the aroma of good food and the warmth of family love, Sarah felt a deep sense of fullness. Her life had been an extraordinary journey, from a hopeless young girl to a global icon, and now back to her roots, finding joy in simple things. She thought of all the lives she had touched over the years, the students from Millionaire'S, the chefs who had grown under her mentorship, the countless viewers who had been inspired by her stories. Each of them was part of her legacy, an extension of the love and passion she had dedicated to gastronomy. As the night progressed and conversations became softer, Sarah allowed herself a moment of silent reflection. The path that had brought her here had been long and often difficult, but each challenge, each obstacle, had been an essential ingredient in her life recipe. The future, she knew, still held many surprises. New flavors to explore, new stories to tell, new lives to touch. But now, with the wisdom of years and the unwavering love of her family, Sarah was ready to savor every moment, every experience, with gratitude and joy. And so, as the moon rose in the New York sky and the sounds of the city created a soft nocturnal symphony, Sarah raised her glass in a silent toast to life, to love, and to the eternal magic of food that unites people and transforms destinies. The banquet of life continued, and Sarah could hardly wait to taste the next dish that destiny would serve her. 10 years had passed since we last saw Sarah. Now, at 55, she watched the sunset from the balcony of her home in New York, reflecting on the changes a decade had brought. The Kitchen of the Heart, her cooking school, had expanded to 3 units in the city, becoming an internationally recognized culinary refuge. People from all over the world came not just to learn techniques, but to experience the philosophy of life that Sarah had cultivated over the years. Her son, now 32, had become a force of nature in the world of social gastronomy. Millionaire'S, under his leadership, was present in more than 100 countries, adapting to local needs and cultures, but always maintaining its essence of transformation through food. That afternoon, Sarah was anxiously awaiting a special visit. Her son was returning from a long trip through Africa, where he had established new Millionaire'S centers in regions affected by conflict and food insecurity. The sound of a car parking made Sarah's heart race. Moments later, her son entered, his face tanned and his eyes shining with the energy of someone who had found their purpose in life. "Mom!" he exclaimed, hugging her tightly. "I have so many stories to tell." As they settled on the balcony with cups of freshly brewed American coffee, her son began to share his experiences. He spoke about a village in South Sudan where the program had not only improved local nutrition, but also helped establish a dialogue between previously conflicting communities. "It's incredible, Mom," said her son, his eyes gleaming with emotion. "I see your legacy spreading in ways we never imagined. In every place we visit, we find people who were inspired by your story." Sarah listened with her heart full of pride and gratitude. Her son had not only continued her work, but had elevated it to new heights. "But I didn't just come to tell stories," her son continued, his tone becoming more serious. "I have a proposal for you, Mom, one that could change everything." Again, Sarah leaned forward, intrigued. Even after so many years, the idea of a new challenge made her heart beat faster. "The UN is planning a global initiative to combat hunger," her son explained. "They want Millionaire'S to be the flagship of the project, and they want you, Mom, to lead it all." The world seemed to go silent for a moment as Sarah absorbed the magnitude of the proposal. At 55, when many would think about slowing down, the universe was offering her the chance to amplify her impact in a way she had never imagined. I don't know what to say," Sarah finally responded, her mind spinning with the possibilities. Her son smiled, recognizing the gleam in his mother's eyes, the same gleam she had when facing a new culinary challenge. "You don't need to answer now," he said softly. "But remember what you always taught me. Life is like a great banquet, and it would be a shame not to taste all the dishes it offers." As the sun set over New York, casting golden hues over the city, Sarah felt a familiar wave of excitement and purpose. The aroma of a new adventure hung in the air, as tempting as the most exotic of dishes. She looked at her son, at the city she loved, and at the vast world beyond. With a smile, Sarah realized she was hungry for this new challenge. The next chapter of her extraordinary journey was about to begin, and she could hardly wait to savor every moment of it. The Grand Hall of the UN in New York was filled with dignitaries, world leaders, and representatives of humanitarian organizations. At the center of the stage, Sarah, now 56, prepared to present the Global Initiative Against Hunger, an unprecedented collaboration between Culinary Seeds and the United Nations. Dressed in an outfit that blended elements from various cultures, an African shawl, Indian jewelry, and a cut reminiscent of Japanese kimonos, Sarah was the embodiment of the global unity that the project represented. "Distinguished guests," she began, her firm voice echoing through the hall, "we are here today not just to discuss policies or numbers, but to rekindle the most fundamental of human connections, the one that occurs around a shared table." As she spoke, images of Culinary Seeds projects around the world were projected behind her, from community gardens in Brazilian favelas to school feeding programs in Southeast Asia. "Hunger is not just a matter of scarcity," Sarah continued, her passion palpable. "It's a matter of distribution, education, and above all, reconnection with our culinary and agricultural roots." She then presented the bold plan of the initiative: establish culinary and agricultural training centers in regions affected by food insecurity, create local food distribution networks, and implement educational programs that combined nutrition, cooking, and sustainability. But the true heart of this project, Sarah emphasized, lies in the idea that each community has its own culinary wealth. "Our goal is not to impose top-down solutions, but to empower people to rediscover and value their own gastronomic treasures." The presentation was received with a standing ovation. World leaders approached to express their support, and funding commitments began to emerge almost immediately. Backstage, her son hugged his mother with pride. "You nailed it, Mom," he said, his eyes shining. "This is going to change the world." In the months that followed, Sarah found herself immersed in frantic activity. Constant travel, meetings with government leaders, training local teams. Each day brought new challenges and opportunities. One of the most ambitious projects was established in the African Sahel, a region plagued by drought and food insecurity. Sarah worked closely with local communities to develop drought-resistant farming techniques and revitalize traditional recipes that had been forgotten over time. During a visit to a village in Mali, Sarah had a moment of profound connection. A local elder, with hands calloused by decades of work, taught her how to prepare an ancestral dish made with a type of drought-resistant millet. "This knowledge," said the elder through an interpreter, "is our heritage. You have helped us remember its value." As she savored the dish, Sarah felt tears in her eyes. This was the true power of food, not just to nourish the body, but to connect. Generations preserve cultures and restore dignity. Back in the United States, Sarah worked tirelessly to adapt the Culinary Seeds model to the massive scale of the UN initiative. New partnerships were formed with universities, technology companies, and community-based organizations. Gabriel, now her life partner for so many years, became an essential pillar of support, managing domestic operations while she traveled the world. Jason and Richard, although older, remained active, offering strategic guidance and logistical support to the expanding project. One night, after a long day of video conferences with field teams on different continents, Sarah found herself in the home kitchen, preparing a simple dish of beans and rice. As she stirred the pot, the familiar aroma filling the kitchen, she was overcome by a wave of emotion. Somehow, this simple act of cooking, the same one she had learned from Mrs. Lewis so many years ago, connected her with all the kitchens around the world where her work was making a difference. Gabriel entered the kitchen, attracted by the smell. Smells like home," he commented, hugging her from behind. Sarah turned, looking into the eyes of the man who had been by her side through so many adventures. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough. The world is so big, the problems so complex." Gabriel smiled, taking a spoon to taste the beans. "Sarah," he said after savoring, "you've transformed your life. into a banquet of love and compassion. Every meal you inspire, every life you touch is a victory. And these beans, they're perfect. Sarah laughed, feeling the weight of the world dissipate a little. She knew the challenges ahead were immense, but she also knew that, dish by dish, person by person, she was helping to create a more nourishing and connected world. As they sat down to dinner, Sarah made a silent prayer of gratitude for the journey life had given her, for the family that supported her, and for the ongoing opportunity to use food as a force for global transformation. The aroma of beans and rice filled the kitchen, a comforting reminder that no matter how far she traveled or how grand her projects were, the heart of her mission would always be rooted in the simple and powerful flavors of home. 3 years had passed since the launch of the global initiative against hunger. Sarah, now 59, found herself in a golden wheat field in rural Ukraine, observing a scene that seemed impossible just a few years ago. Local farmers, many of whom had lost everything during the recent conflict, worked side by side with young chefs trained by the Culinary Seeds program. Together, they were not only cultivating food, but also revitalizing nearly forgotten culinary traditions and creating new recipes that combined modern techniques with ancestral ingredients. "Look, Sarah," said Olena, a middle-aged local farmer, offering her a piece of freshly baked bread. "This is made with the wheat we planted and a fermentation technique your program taught us. It's the taste of hope." Sarah bit into the bread, feeling the crispy crust and soft crumb. The flavor was complex. Nutty notes, a touch of acidity from the fermentation, and something deeper, almost indescribable. It was the flavor of resilience, of a rebuilt community. As she walked through the field, Sarah reflected on the global impact of the initiative. In just 3 years, the program had established a presence in more than 70 countries, adapting to local needs and cultures, but always maintaining its core, using food as a tool for social and economic transformation. In Southeast Asia, abandoned rice fields had been revitalized with sustainable agricultural techniques. In Latin America, small producer cooperatives were revolutionizing local supply chains. In sub-Saharan Africa, school feeding programs were not only combating malnutrition, but also preserving threatened culinary traditions. The success of the program had surpassed even the UN's most optimistic expectations. Preliminary studies indicated a significant reduction in hunger and malnutrition rates in the served regions, as well as a positive impact on the local economy and social cohesion. But for Sarah, the numbers were only part of the story. What really moved her were the individual stories, the gleam in a child's eyes tasting a nutritious meal for the first time, the pride of a farmer seeing their harvest thrive, the joy of a community gathered around a shared meal. Back in her hotel room that night, Sarah had a video call with her son, who was coordinating operations in South America. "Mom, you won't believe it," he exclaimed, barely able to contain his excitement. "We just received the results of the impact study in Brazil. The program has not only reduced hunger, but it's also having a cascade effect on education and public health." Sarah smiled, feeling a wave of pride and gratitude. "It's amazing, my son. Sometimes I still wonder how we got here." Her son laughed. "Well, it all started with a determined young woman set on proving her worth in a kitchen many years ago, didn't it?" Her son's words made her reflect on her journey. From cleaning assistant to leader of a global initiative, each stage, each challenge, each victory had been an essential ingredient in the recipe of her life. That night, before going to sleep, Sarah took out her diary, a habit she had maintained for decades. As she wrote about the day's events, an idea began to form in her mind. It was time to share her story more broadly, not out of vanity, but as a way to inspire others to see the transformative power of food and community. She began to outline a book, not just a cookbook or an autobiography, but a blend of both. A work that would intertwine her personal journey with the stories of the communities she had touched around the world, punctuated with recipes that symbolized each stage of this extraordinary journey. As the ideas flowed, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. At 59, far from thinking about retiring, she was embarking on a new creative adventure. The book would be more than just an account of her life. It would be a testament to the universal power of food to nourish not just bodies, but souls, to build bridges between cultures, to heal old wounds and sow hope for the future. With a smile, she titled the first chapter, From Kitchen to World, a recipe for transformation. As night fell in Ukraine and the aroma of freshly baked bread still lingered in her memories, Sarah fell asleep with a feeling of deep gratitude and anticipation. The next chapter of her life was just beginning, and she could hardly wait to see what new flavors and stories it would bring.